December 1944, the United States Navy was at the height of its power. American carrier groups roamed the Pacific almost without challenge. Japanese naval aviation had been shattered in the Philippine Sea. Leyte Gulf had broken what remained of the Imperial Navy's ability to fight a decisive surface battle. To many in Washington, victory in the Pacific no longer seemed a question of if, only when. And at the center of that power stood Admiral William "Bull" Halsey. He was aggressive, charismatic, and famously uncompromising. Sailors admired him. Reporters loved him. His nickname alone carried weight. Bull. Halsey believed in momentum. Strike hard, move fast, never give the enemy time to recover. It had worked before. In mid-December, Halsey's Third Fleet was operating east of the Philippines, supporting land operations on Luzon. The fleet was massive. Fleet carriers, light carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of sailors. But there was another force moving through the Pacific that week. A tropical disturbance had formed east of the Philippines. Weather tracking in 1944 was crude compared to modern standards. Forecasts came from scattered reports, partial data, and interpretation. Storm systems could shift quickly. Errors were common. Halsey's fleet needed fuel. Destroyers in particular were running low, and refueling at sea required calm conditions. Oilers met the task force. Hoses were stretched between rolling hulls, and ships maneuvered carefully to maintain position. Meanwhile, the barometers began to fall. Reports reached fleet headquarters that a storm was developing. Some estimates suggested it would pass north of the fleet. Others were less certain. The data was incomplete. The Pacific was vast. Halsey faced a choice. He could pull the fleet westward toward clearer waters and postpone refueling operations, risking reduced readiness if Japanese forces appeared. Or he could continue operations, trusting that the storm's path would not intersect directly with his position. He chose to proceed. To Halsey, the greater danger was always the enemy. Japanese naval forces had surprised American commanders before. He believed hesitation invited risk. Moving aggressively, even in uncertain weather, felt consistent with his command style. On December 17th, seas began to rise sharply. Destroyers, the smallest ships in the task force, were already vulnerable. Low on fuel, their ballast was unstable. With fuel tanks nearly empty, they rode higher and rolled more violently. Refueling attempts became increasingly dangerous. Hoses snapped. Ships drifted apart. The wind strengthened. By the early hours of December 18th, the fleet was no longer skirting a storm. It was inside one. Typhoon force winds lashed the task force. Waves towered above decks. Visibility vanished in sheets of rain. Aircraft broke loose on carrier decks. Some were pushed overboard. Others smashed into each other, fuel spilling across pitching steel. Destroyers struggled to maintain heading. Their bows plunged into walls of water. Rudders lost grip. Engine rooms fought to keep power steady as seawater surged across decks. On the USS Hull, the situation grew critical. The ship had taken on a dangerous list. Officers attempted to correct ballast. Orders were shouted against the roar of wind. But the sea was stronger. Nearby, the USS Monaghan and USS Spence were fighting the same battle. No Japanese fleet was in sight. No enemy aircraft attacked. The Third Fleet, one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled, was being torn apart by wind and water. By mid-morning on December 18th, the full scale of the disaster began to emerge. One destroyer rolled past the point of recovery and capsized. Then another. and another. Hundreds of sailors were thrown into the raging sea. Admiral Halsey, aboard his flagship, could do little but issue orders to ride out the storm and preserve what he could. Communications were fragmented, ships were scattered. The fleet had been caught in the core of Typhoon Cobra. By the time the winds began to ease, 3 destroyers were gone. Nearly 800 American sailors were dead. More than 100 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Multiple ships were severely battered. Fires had broken out across carrier decks during the height of the storm. Some vessels had come within minutes of catastrophic structural failure. The enemy had never appeared. The damage had come from a decision, made under uncertainty, to continue operations in deteriorating weather. And when the seas finally calmed, a new storm began. This one would not come from the Pacific. It would come from Washington. When the full reports reached Pearl Harbor and Washington, disbelief came first. 3 destroyers, USS Hull, USS Monaghan, and USS Spence, had capsized and sunk. Nearly 800 sailors were dead. More than 100 aircraft had been destroyed or swept overboard. Several capital ships had suffered structural damage, and all of it had happened without a single shot fired by the enemy. The U.S. Navy had been struck by its own decision-making. Survivors told of ships rolling beyond 40 degrees, of engine rooms flooding, of men clinging to rails as the sea tore lifeboats and aircraft from their lashings. On some destroyers, fuel levels had dropped so low that stability was dangerously compromised. When the storm hit at full force, those lightly ballasted ships became top-heavy and uncontrollable. The question was unavoidable. How had the Third Fleet sailed directly into the center of a typhoon? Weather officers had issued warnings. Barometers had fallen steadily. Reports from nearby vessels described deteriorating conditions. But the data had been fragmented and the storm's projected track uncertain. In the chaos of refueling operations and combat readiness, interpretation mattered, and interpretation flowed upward to the Admiral. Halsey had believed the storm would pass north. He had been wrong. A court of inquiry was convened in early 1945 to examine the disaster. Senior naval officers reviewed logs, signals, forecasts, and command decisions. They reconstructed the fleet's movements hour by hour, plotting positions against the actual path of Typhoon Cobra. The findings were careful, but clear. The court concluded that Admiral Halsey had committed an error in judgment by failing to adequately consider available weather information and by continuing refueling operations in worsening conditions. The report stopped short of recommending formal punishment, but it stated plainly that the losses could have been avoided. For an officer of Halsey's stature, that was no small rebuke. Within the Navy, opinions divided sharply. Many officers remained fiercely loyal. Halsey had led aggressive carrier strikes across the Pacific. He had taken risks that brought victories. To them, the typhoon was a tragic accident amplified by wartime uncertainty. Others were less forgiving. They pointed out that aggressive command, effective against an enemy fleet, did not apply to a storm system. Nature could not be intimidated. Momentum could not overpower wind and physics. A fleet commander's responsibility included restraint. Halsey himself did not deny the outcome. He acknowledged the severity of the losses and expressed regret for the men who had died. But he did not see his decision as reckless. He saw it as a judgment call made in war. Under incomplete information, with operational pressures weighing heavily, the Navy ultimately chose not to remove him from command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, reviewed the findings carefully. Dismissing Halsey in the middle of major Pacific operations would have sent shockwaves through morale and command continuity. Halsey retained strong support among sailors and the public. His removal could have signaled instability at a critical moment in the war. So he remained in command. But the incident left a mark. In December 1944, American power in the Pacific had seemed unstoppable. Typhoon Cobra reminded the Navy that dominance over an enemy did not equal dominance over the environment. Procedures for weather tracking and storm avoidance were revised. Greater caution was institutionalized in fleet operations. For Halsey personally, the storm did not end his career, but it changed how he was viewed. He was no longer only the bold, relentless admiral. He was also the commander who had sailed into a typhoon, and history was not finished testing him yet. Typhoon Cobra should have been the final lesson. It wasn't. 6 months later, in June 1945, Halsey's Third Fleet encountered another powerful storm, later known as Typhoon Connie. Once again, ships were damaged. Once again, vessels were scattered. This time, no destroyers capsized, but the message was unmistakable. The Pacific did not care about reputation. By then, the war was entering its final phase. American forces were closing in on Japan itself. Carrier strikes hit the home islands. Submarines strangled supply lines. The outcome was no longer in doubt. But inside naval circles, Halsey's name carried a new weight. He remained admired for his aggression at Guadalcanal, for carrier warfare in the Central Pacific, for keeping pressure on Japanese forces when caution might have slowed momentum. Sailors still cheered him. Newspapers still celebrated him. Yet the typhoon lingered. Nearly 800 dead. 3 destroyers gone. Dozens of families notified that their sons had been lost, not in combat, but to wind and sea. In private, officers debated what leadership meant at that level of command. Was boldness a virtue without limits? At what point did confidence become overconfidence? How much uncertainty was acceptable when thousands of lives were tied to a single decision? Halsey had not ignored the storm. He had misjudged it. That distinction mattered, but it did not erase consequences. When Japan surrendered in September 1945, Halsey stood among the senior commanders of the Pacific War. The victory was real. The strategic pressure his fleet had maintained played a role in breaking Japan's remaining capacity to fight. History recorded him as one of the Navy's most aggressive wartime leaders. But history also recorded December 18, 1944. Typhoon Cobra became a case study in naval academies. Weather assessment improved dramatically in the post-war years. Fleet procedures for storm avoidance were strengthened. The disaster-shaped doctrine long after the wreckage had settled at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Halsey retired in 1947 and was later promoted to Fleet Admiral. Public memory often focuses on his victories, carrier battles, daring strikes, relentless pursuit. Yet leadership is rarely defined by triumph alone. The storm exposed something uncomfortable. Even the most powerful navy in the world could be brought to its knees by a miscalculation. Even a celebrated commander could be one decision away from catastrophe. The enemy that week had no flag, no fleet, no guns, only pressure, wind, and waves. And for a few violent hours in December 1944, the United States Navy learned that command authority does not conquer nature. It answers to it. That was Halsey's storm, and it nearly became his legacy.